What I would say is more important to me in terms of legacy is actually reframing the narrative around motherhood and womanhood to celebrate and support women for their reproductive powers rather than penalizing and marginalizing them. Right now, we live in a society where our reproductive physiology is an inconvenient necessity at best. Even in the US, it's sort of like, oh, well, gosh, she's got to go on mat leave, and what are we going to do? And everyone's kind of just like working around it. It's something to be managed and tolerated. The reframe is that this person is creating human life, feeding the future generation of our society, and contributing to economic development and reinvesting that income into their families and communities. So this person is contributing to society in a way that is unimaginable and trying to juggle it all. And so instead of just tolerating women during this period, we should be celebrating them.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unmedia Moments. If you're listening to the show for the very first time, this is a podcast about finding and owning your voice. I'm your host, Ahis, and today I'm excited to be joined by Sahar Jamal. She's the founder and CEO of Maziwa Breastfeeding, a Kenyan-based company on a mission to empower mothers so they don't have to choose between their careers and their families. So her story has taken her around the world. Her family is from Tanzania and India. She grew up in Canada. She's lived in the US and the UK. And now she's building a technology company in Kenya that supports women's health. She's also the first TEDx speaker I've ever had on the show. So I'm really excited, given the purpose of this show is about how we use our voices. Sahar, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
I want to start from your roots, your upbringing. And I mentioned you recently did a TEDx talk about motherhood and women. But let's just take it back. Growing up in Canada, how did your heritage impact finding your own voice?
Yeah, it's definitely been a journey. I grew up in Vancouver, and it's a pretty diverse city. I'd say Vancouver and Toronto are the most diverse cities in Canada, certainly, but they're actually majority minority. I don't know if that was the case when I was younger, but now they're majority minority, which means that Caucasian folks are the actual minority there, which is pretty unique, I would say, in this world.
Between the two cities?
Yeah, they're both over 50% people of color.
I did not know that. So just learned something new today.
Yeah, so I mean, in that sense, there was a lot of diversity around me. On the other hand, I think we still kind of grew up with this immigrant mentality, and my parents had moved. My mom, at least, had moved only a couple of years before I was born. My dad had been in Vancouver a little bit longer. But I was basically like raised by my grandparents because my parents were accountants and I was born during tax time, they always tell me.
Really?
And so even though English is my first language, I grew up speaking another Indian dialect. And so I had quite a heavy accent. I certainly wasn't like the coolest kid. I had not the best clothes and stuff like that. So going into elementary school, I remember once I said the word bowel instead of bowl, and I got made fun of so much. And so there was a lot of traumatic elementary school experiences just being like an immigrant kid. And that probably made me silence my voice a lot when I was younger. I think, if you look at kids when they're tiny, they kind of are able to dance and sing and enjoy themselves. And there's a lot of videos of me doing all that when I was very young. But between elementary school and middle school and high school, I kind of became more shy, or I was a little bit less confident about just doing whatever I wanted. And even though my mom put me in all kinds of programs like ballet and piano and all these things, eventually I quit everything. I didn't want to do it anymore. And so there was a moment in my life where I really did feel like I had been silenced. And I think it was just this fact that we were growing up in a place that we didn't feel like we belonged, or we had a hard time seeing people who look like us prominently in the media or in positions of power, or kind of just living their true selves. And so I think that had a pretty deep impact on my teenage years. And luckily, I was able to turn that around later in life, going to school and getting a job and kind of finding my confidence and just learning that what I have to contribute is valuable and I should continue to do so.
The example about you said bowl instead of bowl? Is that the example?
Yeah.
It reminds me of an experience freshman year in college. I went to a small school for undergrad in Kentucky. And when you do orientation, even at Bisco, like in the first couple of weeks, there's a lot of games and activities. And there was a game that we're doing, like everyone was in a circle, and you're supposed to bring an object into the circle. So you name an object that's around you or something. And I was going to say a shirt, but I said shit, or something like that. Because we don't say the R in Nigeria, we don't say the R. So instead of shirt, I said shit or something like that. And everyone busted out laughing. And I was, what did I do? I was so confused. Yeah. And then I realized what they meant. Oh my goodness, I felt so embarrassed. So anyways, your story just kind of reminded me about that. So in those moments growing up, did you guys have, because oftentimes immigrants will live in an area or neighborhood where they're fellow immigrants of that same culture. So did you have that to lean on growing up during those times?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we had our religious community, and so I would, have friends from that community, and that was always nice. The suburb that we grew up in was actually quite East Asian. So we had a lot of Chinese neighbors. I had Japanese students living in my house growing up. And so we were really exposed to that kind of culture. And that also helps, of course, to not feel you're a complete minority. But yeah, we certainly weren't in the Indian suburb, which is another area of Vancouver.
So is there any specific instance or moment that comes to mind that you say, hey, here's what sort of triggered the person I am today? Or that moment made me realize the power in my voice.
Yeah, I don't know if it was one moment specifically, but it might have been like a series of moments. I think the big thing that also was influential when I was younger is that I traveled quite a bit. So my mom told me the story of the fact that I went to India when I was 6 months old. She traveled alone with me in the plane from Vancouver to India, which is insane. And I also traveled to Tanzania as a young kid. So, of course, I don't remember the 6-month-old trip, but after several trips back and forth to my parents' hometowns, I was able to gain exposure to how life is so different, or at least back then it was very different in Bombay and Dar es Salaam than it was in Vancouver. And I kind of, one, recognized how much privilege I had being able to grow up in Canada and have access to certain resources and social support that a lot of families don't have across the world. And I also realized that there was kind of a reason. There's a reason they moved here, and it made me feel like I had a responsibility to make the most of it. And so I think that kind of influenced my decision to focus on social impact and international development later in my life. So as a teenager, I started volunteering for an organization called the Aga Khan Development Network. In undergrad, I led the nonprofit club and had a lot of fundraising internships where I helped organizations raise money for good causes. And that's where I really started to find my voice, because I felt that I had something unique to add. It almost felt to me people were sort of living their lives not recognizing that they carry so much privilege. And that conversation around turning your privilege into your responsibility was something that I was really passionate about in those younger days. And I think all of that maybe reinforced the necessity for me to speak.
That's a good example of sometimes like you have to go out there and see what other people are facing for you to appreciate what you have. And it sounds like that was the powerful moment for you. But as you mentioned the story about how your mom, when you were 6 months old, took you to India and all that stuff. So let's just set the stage in terms of your background. So your parents, did both of your parents spend time or grow up in Tanzania and from India? Just set the stage for us, just so we understand the cultural background here.
Yeah, absolutely. So my dad was born in Dar es Salaam. His family has 3 generations in Tanzania, which means that they're effectively Tanzanian. However, they're racially Indian. So there was a big migration path where a lot of Indians moved to East Africa because of the British, often to help build the railroad or just to work in those regions. And so he's Indian Tanzanian. And his ancestors came from the same place or similar places as my mom's ancestors. However, she was born in Bombay in India. And she had never, I think she might have been to Tanzania once because she had some family there, but she had never had any exposure to East Africa growing up. Now, my dad had moved to Canada. He'd moved to the UK and then Canada for school and then work. And my mom was just visiting on a volunteer trip, if I'm not mistaken, or just to see some family in Canada. And so they kind of spontaneously met in Vancouver. They went on one date, talked for hours, and then they were suddenly engaged. And so they got engaged and then married very quickly. And she moved to Canada, and then shortly after I was born. So she was relatively new to Canada. My dad had had a bit more exposure. And then I was born in Vancouver. And so, yeah, I have no Indian or Tanzanian passport, just a Canadian one, sadly. But yeah, I still grew up feeling quite Indian.
That's very helpful context. So Tanzanian side, that's from your dad. That's from your dad, essentially. And then your mom came directly from India. Okay. And as I mentioned, you've also lived in the UK. You work in the UK, and obviously you also were in the US. So can you walk us through those points in your life when you had to make those trips and how you felt a sense of belonging to those places, if you did feel a sense of belonging in those different places you lived in?
First and foremost, I would say I was fortunate to have English as my first language. I was fortunate to move to cities that were relatively diverse. And so I totally acknowledge that sometimes moves might be much more challenging for folks. But I moved from Vancouver, went to a university in Ontario, the east side of Canada. Then I lived in Toronto for 5 years. And then I was relocated with my work from Toronto to London. And I think, again, I was, fortunate because I was working for Johnson & Johnson, and they provide quite a bit of support as it relates to relocation. So to the extent that I actually got cultural training, and they were trying to explain to me the differences between Canada and the UK. Now, you would think that there wouldn't be many, but there was some in terms of even the bluntness or directness and politeness and things like that. So even if you might imagine these Commonwealth countries are sort of similar, it was interesting to learn about that. And maybe I'll also just point to a resource in case anyone is going through this and relocating. There's something called Culture Map, where you can look at different cultures and how they might behave on a spectrum of indirect to direct or formal to informal, etc. And like I said, I was working on the Nordic region, so Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, and Norway. And I put Nordics, UK, and Canada on the culture map. And surprisingly, there was pretty meaningful differences in all of them, even though you'd think they were quite similar. And then I put myself and answered some questions about my own personality. And even I was very different than some of these cultures, including Canada, because I had grown up with a different cultural heritage, right? So anyways, I found that tool quite useful in navigating certain differences. And I can imagine if you moved to Japan or Korea or something, it would be even more useful. And certainly in Kenya, there's a lot of dynamics that are different than what I'm used to as well. But in terms of the sense of belonging, I think finding your tribe and finding your people is critical. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be your racial or cultural tribe, although that might be something that you're more comfortable with, and that's absolutely fair. For me, again, I was lucky that London, Nairobi, Chicago, all of them had enough people who are not from those cities, or either expats or immigrants. And I often gravitated towards that group because we had some things in common. Not only did we face the same challenges, we also had a very similar worldview. So even in Kenya, I mean, of course, I have tons of Kenyan friends as well, but people who up and leave their lives and move to Nairobi are a specific breed of person. And I actually find I have a ton in common with them compared to probably my friends who still live in Vancouver and have never left, right? So certainly there are challenges, but I actually feel like I've built very close, meaningful relationships with people who are very similar to me or have a lot of the same values because of the many moves that I've done.
So I guess the summary is find your community, whatever that might be. So let's fast forward now. As I mentioned, you're in Kenya. And this show, a lot of the audience are immigrants, people who moved from Africa or India or from other parts of the world to the US. So in your case, you did the reverse, right? You were born in Canada, you did your MBA in the US, and then you went to Kenya. So how has that been for you personally and professionally? Because I imagine some of the corporate infrastructure, if you have a job, you work one of the big firms in Canada or the UK, like the Johnson & Johnson, for example, that's a lot different than the infrastructure you might have working in whether it's a corporate or startup setting like you are in Kenya. So how has that dynamic played out for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, again, I will caveat to say that like Nairobi is quite developed. And so if I had moved to like the outskirts of Kenya, somewhere in the rural areas or villages, I think it would be much more challenging. And often I work in those settings, so I do sometimes travel there, but I'm fortunate to live in the main city that has internet connectivity, has I can order a latte, whatever, right? Like it's sort of similar to the West. Yeah. And so maybe that's also a perception that needs to be changed. I know that you're probably familiar with it having come from the continent. But I mean, certainly my parents who are immigrants to Canada didn't expect me to move back the other way. But I do feel like I've learned a lot in doing so. And I do feel like the continent of Africa is the future of our global society. And so,
Amen.
yeah, so I do feel like there's a lot of benefits to moving to a place like this where there's a huge blue ocean in terms of like the business side of things. There's a lot of space for innovation and a lot of space for, new developments. So the transition has been probably better than you might think. But I think that the hardest part has actually been this dynamic of being used to being a minority that has seemingly less privilege in a place like Canada or the US or UK to moving towards becoming a privileged minority because of the way that I look here. So again, like I said, there's been a dynamic of migration in Kenya and countries in East Africa where a lot of Indians moved here thanks to the British. And they moved here with paying jobs as opposed to the Black Africans who did not have paying jobs at the time. So generations of that actually created a bit of inequality between Indian Kenyans and Black Kenyans. Now, coming here as someone who is not only Indian in race, but also someone who is Canadian and comes from that background, makes people assume things about me that are probably true, that I come with privilege. And that is a very odd dynamic for me because I've always been the opposite scenario. As a woman of color, most places I've lived in, I've been a minority that does not have natural privilege. And so it's just been a really interesting experience to feel that discomfort and try and navigate it in a way that is generative, in a way that actually can, again, use your privilege as your responsibility or use your privilege as your opportunity to do something good with it. So I think that's been the hardest transition. And I would also say like Kenya is a more homogenous country than the countries that I've come from or lived in the past, like the US, Canada, UK are all a little bit more diverse just because of the nature of, again, migration patterns. And so you really you notice the delineation and the differences more here. But I also think that Nairobi, again, luckily is a little bit more developed, welcomes all kinds of expats. So my everyday life is full of diversity. And yeah, so all that to say is that it's just an interesting dynamic. And I think I have some more empathy for kind of, the other side of the racial equation that I never did.
It's interesting, the idea of like a privileged minority. You think about minority and think about underprivileged. It's an interesting dynamic as you described it. What are the types of things that you do to try to dispel that? I don't know if that's something that you actively think of.
Yeah, and also to clarify that I'm not trying to say, oh, woe is me, like I had Canadian education, of course that's, of course that's, that's the nature of it, and I'm grateful for that, and so I'm not necessarily complaining. But what I will say is that when I come into a meeting, if I'm there with an expert from my team who knows much more about a topic than I do, similar to what you might observe about the white male syndrome, people kind of gravitate towards the white man in the room. That happens with me. And so if I have my Kenyan colleague who's a breastfeeding expert or who's a sales expert or finance expert, people might talk to me first. And certainly I'm the leader of the company, so that could be why. But I try and navigate the conversation to the other person in the room that has more knowledge or more expertise about the topic than I do. And so just trying to share the space, I guess, for conversation and ensure that the right people are speaking to the right topics.
There's a good model for any leader in any kind of environment where whether it's based on gender, it's based on race, or whatever it might be, to know yes, if people assuming that, oh yes, I am the one who's the expert when I am not. It's like it's on you to try to make sure those people who are already experts get involved and you can showcase whatever skills or abilities that they have. So I think this is actually a great segue to talking about your company. So why don't you tell us about Maziwa Breastfeeding, why you started it, and what the mission is?
Sure, absolutely. So I was at grad school with you, Ahis, and I was, again, like I said, focused on social impact. I was trying to transition from my background at Johnson & Johnson, which was in healthcare, to a more global health-focused role. And I had the opportunity to intern at a place called Jacaranda Health in Nairobi. This was a maternal and child health-related organization, and it was focused on various topics around delivery, reducing the number of premature child deaths, focused on improving the health of the women and children that came into its facilities, working with public sector and public hospitals to improve their nurse training or their educational tools that they had. And so I got very involved in sort of all of those areas, but one area in particular and one project in particular that I worked on was focused on breastfeeding. And I had the opportunity to interview hundreds of moms about their breastfeeding experience. And, we were trying to find out, are you appropriately breastfeeding your child? And when we asked questions about breastfeeding, even in the areas where English was not very strong, I would hear back, I exclusively breastfeed my child for 6 months. It was almost like a script. And I was kind of wondering, this is odd, like you're using such a specific phrase, And I was like, so weird. Like, why is everyone saying this exact line? And so then I was like, okay, well, maybe we should dig in a bit more. And so I worked with the translator to ask, what did the baby eat yesterday? And then you would start hearing back, oh, they had some porridge or they had some uji or something like that. And then you realize that in Kenya, because the public health messaging is so strong, people are trained to recite what they think you want to hear, right? So they're just kind of like, yeah, get off my case. I exclusively breastfeed, And so you feel bad because you're shaming these women for doing something that they don't have a choice but to do. And so I realized that the education was not the problem. Clearly, everyone's been trained very effectively as to what they should say. The problem was practical support. And so when you start hearing about why they supplemented with other foods earlier than they maybe should have, it was because they returned to work or they had to leave the house. Here in Kenya, there is only maternity leave for 3 months, and most women that we work with don't even get that maternity leave. They often are working informally. They go back to work 1 or 2 months after giving birth. Now, when babies are not exclusively breastfed, and what that means is only given breast milk for the first 6 months, especially if they are having things like cow's milk instead, this can be really detrimental for their health. So it actually makes a baby 14 times more likely to die prematurely because the substitutes are not optimal. Like formula is not a prevalent thing. It's quite expensive here. And so animal milk is not great for a baby's digestive system. And it's not great for a mom either because the mom is not expressing or feeding the milk that she has in her body. So that can also cause breast cancer and ovarian cancer and all kinds of things. So for good reason, the public health messaging has been so strong, but it hasn't been paired with practical support. So after graduating from Kellogg, I worked with a team to develop a wearable, discreet, portable breast pump that could be used in any kind of workplace environment, especially in the low resource settings that we work in. And we've seen it used in marketplaces, construction sites, all kinds of locations. And we also launched a network of breastfeeding ambassadors that provide lactation support to ensure that the practical support that women need in their breastfeeding journey is also coupled with the product.
The 6 month thing, I don't know if it's like a Commonwealth thing, because growing up in Nigeria, I also heard this whole idea of like breastfeeding for 6 months. I don't know if it's like a Commonwealth thing, all the Commonwealth countries just have this whole messaging where you exclusively breastfeed for 6 months, but like in reality, it might be slightly different. So, because we just had, my wife and I had our second child about a year ago now. A few months after we had him, she went back to work. And in order for her to actually, she's in medicine, and to actually do her job, having this breast pump was very instrumental in doing so. As she's patients, walks around the hospital and whatnot. So in terms of adopting the technology to the population that you serve, what is different? What did you have to do differently for those breast pumps compared to like the breast pumps that may be available here in the US?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few key differences. If you imagine a workplace for an average woman here, it's not an office. It's usually something that requires you to be outside, probably not connected to electricity. There isn't usually a fridge around. Like if I use the example of a construction site, one of the women that we worked with was working in a construction site. So there wasn't access to all of those amenities at a construction site, let alone even like a bathroom to pump milk. And so we needed to make it battery operated so that it could be charged overnight and used throughout the day. We needed to equip it with a portable milk storage cooler so that the milk would last and be fresh for the day, even without a fridge. And we also needed to ensure that it was discreet enough to use in public and not necessarily require like a private room, bathroom, lactation room to be used, and ensure the woman doesn't have to be fully exposed while pumping. And again, despite there being laws around protected time for breastfeeding during the workday, most employers don't follow those laws. So we had to make sure it was efficient. And so we couldn't just give them a manual pump that takes 45 minutes. We'd have to have an electric pump that can express the milk relatively quickly so that she does have enough time to do that during her workday.
So would you say, because it sounds like there's a lot of thoughts that went into all these different problems and trying to address them. So I guess for you, is Maziwa a technology company? Is that how, I don't know how you see your mission. Is it from like a technology side and people side? And how do you see your mission?
Yeah, I would say that we are an accessibility company, that we provide access to a technology that is useful and to services that are useful within the breastfeeding journey. And it's all about reaching moms who have been left out of the system. Prior to Maziwa launching, only 7% of moms in all of Kenya had ever used a breast pump. Because either they couldn't afford it or they had never heard of a breast pump. They figured that it was a Western tool that's not really for them. A good chunk of moms don't work, but of the working moms who need it, and about 60% of moms do work, they are missing out on this tool that is could be very useful for them in their workplaces. So our goal was to increase market penetration, essentially, using business terms, right? So how do we go from 7% to 60% to ensure that most working moms have access to a tool that can help them express breast milk so that they don't have to choose between working and breastfeeding?
Sounds like the education piece would be a big part of the story here. So how have you gone about spreading the word?
Yeah, so we recruit community breastfeeding ambassadors, or CBAs, and these are influential mothers in their communities, or they're community health workers who are recruited by the government. Many of them have gone through breastfeeding themselves in the past, and some of them are also healthcare workers, so they have some health background. But we do a 3-day training with them where we give them the basics of lactation support, so that we can kind of democratize access to lactation consultants. So in the US, a lot of moms use lactation consultants. Here, in the entire country, there's 1 or 2 IBCLCs, which is International Board Certified Lactation Consultants. This is for this population, it's very underrepresented. There are a few lactation educators who are not board certified, but even then it's maybe 20 or so, not tons, for the whole country. And the only the one IBCLC there is actually working on our team, so working for us. So she conducts trainings with these community breastfeeding ambassadors, and then they get enough knowledge to host mother-to-mother support groups where they have monthly groups that mothers can come into, ask questions, and receive support as needed.
And in terms of just the economics of it all, how does that, relatively speaking, compare to other options I might have? How do you think about pricing and in the context of accessibility for those moms?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we reach our lower income moms, we have a couple offerings that are more affordable than just the outright sale price. We either give them the option to rent the pump, or we work with their employers to purchase the pumps on their behalf. Our rental model is about $7 a month, which is cheaper than animal milk. It's certainly cheaper than formula, but even cheaper than animal milk, which is their other more realistic alternative. On the corporate side, we work with large flower farms or telecoms, or if you can imagine large employers of women, maybe a manufacturing plant, to purchase communal pumps where a mother can use the pump for 6 to 8 to 10 months. When she's done with the pump, the plastic parts are replaced. We give them new plastic parts, so it's effectively a new pump, and then another mother can use it in the future. So it's an affordable way for them to support their working moms.
It sounds like you have different tiers so there's a rental model, and then in terms of the ones, the non-rental, is it just one price or the different prices, different styles, different types?
Yeah, we have 2 types. We just launched the newest type in August. One of them is called Wema, which is our original product, and that one goes for about $100. And then the second one is called Zawadi, and that one goes for about, let's say, $130. And that's the outright sale price. And these are usually bought by middle to high income moms in the country, and then the profits from those sales go towards subsidizing our community breastfeeding ambassador program, which is completely free for moms, as well as our rental and our corporate packages.
That's awesome. So it sounds like your goal, your mission, is very socially inclined in terms of taking the profits from this side of the house and using it to create products that are more accessible or provide more options for those lower income women.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's been the hardest, even in the US, building a startup, being a CEO, being a founder has its own challenges, and it's not for everyone, right? So for you, you have the added element of going to a new country or new population, maybe different laws and all that dynamic. What's been the hardest part of this journey for you so far?
Yeah, I think prevalent in my mind right now, just because of the landscape of global development at the moment, is funding. Right now, the whole landscape is falling apart. And I mean, I'm sure you know of USAID pulling out of all countries, everyone getting fired. And they were a huge player. Luckily, we didn't have funding from them, so we were okay. A lot of our funding comes from the Canadian government. But yeah, that's pretty big. And then balancing that with, whether you bring in investors and whether, focus on that side of the funding space is also interesting as well, because you need to look for impact investors who are ensuring that your impact comes first, and they're not looking for VC returns. They're also focused on, getting a reasonable return, but also making a big impact with their investment. And so navigating that landscape and the gray areas between, pure VC unicorn style investment versus pure grant and development funding has been, a huge learning for me. And I also will say that because we are a company that focuses on working mothers in Kenya, not only is there the dynamic of gender, so most of the people we talk to are men, and I have to kind of educate the audience to understand the dynamics of breastfeeding, understand that women actually work in Kenya, believe it or not. They're actually leaving their babies, they're not just sitting at the farm or something like that. And so that has been a process of education, but also our population probably makes about, let's say, $3 to $6 a day. And that is not considered below the poverty line. And because we're not below the poverty line, which is about $2, sometimes we don't qualify for grant funding for people who only want to focus on basic pyramid. On the other hand, we can't charge prices to these moms that will drive VC returns, clearly, right? So we're kind of in this interesting middle ground that also requires not only some education, but also, creativity around fundraising, where we're trying to make the case that if we are not there as a product for this mom, she might lose her job, or she may stop working, or she might lose income, at least in the short term. And then that might make her family fall below the poverty line, because she is at this kind of sensitive point where she's their family is just above the poverty line. So there's an interesting dynamic that something that might be considered social impact in the US, clearly breastfeeding, healthcare, obviously social impact in the US, because it's in Kenya or because it's in East Africa, it's not automatically as impactful as, let's say, providing a well to a rural community that lives below the poverty line.
That's an interesting dynamic. So just in terms of the perception of clean water, the clean water one, I think being in the States, it's a very common one, whether even through sports, some of the superstars or whatever, I'm going to go to this country in Africa and provide clean water to a village of 1,000 people or some number of people. It's a very common thing that you hear. But obviously breastfeeding, not so much. So would you say that comes down to just education, a clean water thing being perceived as impact or social impact, and something like women's health or breastfeeding not being perceived as social impact? And what would you attribute that dynamic to?
I mean, I think it's a pure misunderstanding of the continent of Africa, right? So I think, as much as there are people on the continent who certainly do need clean water, and that is certainly a problem that needs to be tackled, it's not the only problem here. It's not the only cause worth supporting. I also think there's this sort of, for lack of a better phrase, poverty porn of when someone is going to donate to a cause, you want to have the most underprivileged or the most detrimental situation that you support. And so, I mean, people have the right to donate to whatever they think is best. And certainly, we're not trying to take away donations from very worthy causes. But when I think about grant funders, a lot of them have this threshold of the poverty line. And for me, it feels a bit short-sighted, because what we should really be trying to do is that people who already have jobs, let's try and keep them in those jobs, because unemployment rates are so high here. And so if that woman has managed to get a job that she's happy with and she's going to, then if she's at risk of losing that because she's delivering and raising a child, which is also a noble service, let's support her in any way possible to retain her job and also be able to raise her family.
Yeah, so that's the long-term thinking piece of it. Stateside, we've heard a lot about the USAID or the USAID, all those types of cuts. But I think it's very interesting to actually hear it in practice, or hear someone who's actually in that world. Because I think part of why things like that get cut is a lot of people don't even have that connection to it. So to say, oh yes, I'm going to cut this, we give 10 billion, I don't know, some amount of money to some country somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Asia. All right, why do I care? But I think we need stories like this. We need stories for people to hear, people's livelihood actually like depends on things like this, and not just people's livelihood, also like the kids, making sure like they get what they need to grow up to be strong and healthy kids.
Just one thing to add there,
Yeah.
the reason people should care is because the population of Africa, especially the young population of Africa, is going to be the majority of the population of the world, right? Like the average age here is 18. Yep. The number of babies being born here on the continent is higher than anywhere else in the world. And so I don't know what the stat is, but I think by like 2030, is it that 50% of the population will be African or something? Like, I think
I've seen some, I don't remember the actual stat. I've seen something like that. I don't remember the actual stats.
And so this is going to be the future of this whole world. And if they're not raised appropriately, and if they, are not breastfed and are not nourished in the way that they should be, that there is like meaningful differences. Like there's actually a stat that shows that children who are breastfed actually have higher earnings than those who are not. Like the cognitive development is so stark between breastfeeding and not breastfeeding that it actually impacts earnings in the long term.
Oh, wow. Was this study more like in the US or back in Kenya?
No, it was probably a US study or a global study.
Okay, global study. Oh, I was thinking the reason why they might earn more is because maybe they're less sick. It sounds like it's more like cognitive development, not just like being sick or not being sick. So.
Yeah, it's all of those things. I mean, at the very basic level, it's premature death. So children under 5, 820,000 children under 5 die due to suboptimal breastfeeding every year.
Wow.
And can I just correct our statistic? It's 25% of the population by 2050. Yeah. So one in 4 people. Yeah.
Still very significant.
So let's spend some time to talk about legacy. You shared, I think, on LinkedIn recently, you did half marathon. Congratulations, by the way. You said you finished third with the third best Canadian record or something.
There was only 4 of us though, so it's not really.
But you're top 3 out of 4.
Exactly.
Right? It still counts top 3. Congratulations on doing it. I have never done anything like that in my life. I imagine it takes a lot of time and effort and training to be able to pull something like that off. So I know you did that in honor of your mom, right? Also to raise some funds for cancer research.
That's right. Yeah.
So how has your mom's legacy impacted your work today? And how do you see it impact the types of things that you build or types of problems that you look forward to addressing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my mom has been such an important influence in my life. She sacrificed everything for our well-being, our livelihood growing up. We didn't have like a lot of money growing up, but my parents still saved whatever they could to send us to private school or to good schools. They never bought like a nice car, or they didn't, do things for themselves. So, at the very basic level, we kind of owe them everything. But she's also a working mom. So like I joked, right? Like she went straight to the office after giving birth to me because it was tax time, and she was managing our accounting businesses in Vancouver. And so I saw firsthand what it is like to try and raise a family and also run businesses. She raised 2 kids and ran 2 businesses. And so all of her time was occupied by those activities. And so she really hardly did anything for herself. And she was always trying to kind of give back to her family and her community. And there's a lot of parallels between her and the women that we serve, because when you look at women, especially working women, and by the way, all mothers are working mothers, whether you're at home or whether you work outside of the home, but you're trying to make ends meet for your family. Women are proven to reinvest more of their income into their families and communities than men. And I think there's a wiring in female biology that kind of just makes mothers more attuned to like sustainability and long-term thinking and just being able to help their families survive and thrive. So she's been an immense influence as it relates to my work. And my recent TEDx Nairobi talk actually was focused on what I call the alchemy of motherhood, which is the superpowers of moms and of women that are unleashed throughout our journey. And I do feel like while there has been much progress in discussing gender equality and the importance of that, I don't think we have gone far enough in actually recognizing that this is not just about being fair and equitable between genders. It's actually about acknowledging that women are powerful and strong leaders because of our reproductive physiology. Whether or not we have kids, we all have this ability to create life. And that unlocks hormones and strengths that allow us to be creative, innovative, generative, long-term thinking, sustainability focused. And I often tell female entrepreneurs this because usually female entrepreneurs are told, oh, only 2% of VC funding goes towards you, and men are more risk-taking, and you might be more conservative, and all these things. And we don't focus enough time on actually acknowledging that there are parts of our cycle every month that actually make us extremely creative and innovative. And there are features that we have in our bodies built in that are focused on generative thinking and that actually unlock those. So, going through this experience with my mom, she unfortunately passed away because of a women's cancer, also helped me acknowledge that some of these illnesses are actually underrepresented. And if you look at clinical trials for cancer and for other things, most clinical trials were not even required to include women in their databases until 1993. So a law passed very recently to say you must include women in your trials, right? And that's mad. And that also kind of led to the fact that the type of cancer my mom had was extremely rare. It didn't have enough research behind it. And we were working in the dark, right? We were blind. We were not able to decide what to do next as easily as if we had some of this research to help us. So the money that we're raising is to try and contribute to that effort, ensure that underrepresented women's cancers are funded. And all of this is sort of in service of the same goal, which is to support and celebrate women and moms, not only for the purpose of fairness and equality, but to actually unleash and unlock superpowers that are good for our global society.
It's awesome that you channel moments of grief into something as positive as this and giving your TED Talk. What are some of the things that you fall back on, that you rely on to pick yourself up, to keep going when the tough times hit?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I do think health and well-being are an extremely important part of the founder journey. There's some pretty stark statistics about the mental health and well-being of founders and how it can be very extremely tied to the success or failure of the organization. And as much as that makes sense, and when we run a company, it's our baby, I do think separating the two and having your own value and your own persona and your own successes and failures as an individual that are separate from the company, I think that's a critical aspect. So for me personally, I've been able to tap into a spirituality practice that includes a bit of meditation, yoga, sometimes dance, any kind of movement. Yeah, dance, song, all that kind of thing. And I've been really lucky that Nairobi has a very strong wellness and spirituality community that I can engage with to sort of hold me accountable, to make me sure I'm taking care of myself in addition to taking care of my business. Yeah, so that's what works for me. And of course, having the community itself is useful as well.
That's a great distinction you made about separating the business and the person. Because I can see how it could be very easy to just 24/7 just focus on the business and thinking, I guess the thought process could be if the business succeeds, so I succeed kind of thing. So when it's all said and done, say your grandest goal for your company is achieved, what's that legacy you want to leave behind to say, yes, this is what impact I was able to live in the world?
Yeah, I mean, we have our metrics that we always kind of recite and work towards. By 2029, we aim to reach 500,000 mothers with our products and services. So that's kind of our numeric goal. But what I would say is more important to me in terms of legacy is actually reframing the narrative around motherhood and womanhood to celebrate and support women for their reproductive powers rather than penalizing and marginalizing them. Right now, we live in a society where our reproductive physiology is an inconvenient necessity at best. Even in the US, it's sort of oh, well, gosh, she's got to go on mat leave, and what are we going to do? And everyone's kind of just working around it. It's something to be managed and tolerated. The reframe is that this person is creating human life, feeding the future generation of our society, and contributing to economic development and reinvesting that income into their families and communities. So this person is contributing to society in a way that is unimaginable and trying to juggle it all. And so instead of just tolerating women during this period, we should be celebrating them. And so I think that narrative shift is the legacy that I would like to leave. And coupled with that comes better research for women's cancers. It comes with helping girls go to school when they have their period. Not that I'm going to tackle all these issues, but it's the symptoms of the same cause, right? The cause is that we're not acknowledging and supporting and celebrating female physiology in the way that we should be. And hence, we need to do things like force people to have a lactation room in their office or things like that. If we thought about it differently and we thought that this is a mother creating a human life with her body, let's just think about that for a second. And we really acknowledge that, we wouldn't be fighting about this stuff. Like, 1 year paid maternity leave, of course. Like, what job could you be doing that's harder than this, So that's kind of a grand, ambitious goal, perhaps. But I think beyond my company and beyond reaching, I hope, millions of women in the long term, I really believe that championing this message is the real legacy that I'd like to leave.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you've done so far, for all the different innovative products that you were offering to those women in Kenya. And thank you for choosing to go back to Kenya and go back to Africa. So always my final question, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
This is a good question. Yeah, this is not maybe word for word the advice that I received, but it goes like this. It was from someone who was talking to me about investment and funding, because that is an area of challenge for me. And it also relates to this idea of womanhood and maybe feeling underrepresented or under-supported. And they said to me that you are one of the best opportunities for arbitrage because the market has undervalued you, because only 2% of VC funding goes to women, because only a certain percentage of women are leaders. In any scenario that you're in, even as a minority, whether it's gender or minority, we are the best opportunity for arbitrage because we as an asset have been undervalued by the market. And so anyone who invests in us is likely to get a great return because we are going to prove everyone wrong and we are going to prove our value in a way that is unexpected. And so reframing that narrative about being a minority in gender or race or any of that was really powerful to me. I think I would say the same thing to an immigrant moving to a new country looking for a job. You might be misunderstood or undervalued because maybe you have an accent or maybe English isn't your first language or maybe you just moved there. But you have the opportunity to prove people wrong. And if people invest in you and those managers who believe in you actually take the leap and give you a chance, you're going to give them an immense amount of return. And they're going to be lucky that they did that. So I liked that reframing of arbitrage.
That's awesome. I've never heard that one before, but that is very powerful. I think that's a great place to end it today. So Sahar, really thank you for your time. So for all those of you who are listening, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If so, please leave us a 5-star review on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. I'm Mahis, and as always, stay unmuted.